Hello, I'm John, and I wanted to talk about this poem that I've been spending some time with, Anecdote of the Jar, written by Wallace Stevens, I believe in 1918, while he was staying in Tennessee. It was published in his first collection of poems, entitled Harmonium in 1923. Below is a photo taken of Wallace Stevens sitting next to the other great American poet, Robert Frost. They are outside the Casa Marina Hotel in Key West, Florida, and this is in 1940. Apparently, a biographer was recording their conversations, or at least part of them, among which there was the following exchange. Wallace Stevens, speaking to Robert Frost, said, "The problem with you, Robert, is that you write about subjects," to which Frost replied, "The problem with you, Wallace, is that you write about bric-a-brac." I'll let you be the judge of that. Why don't we first take a look at the title of the poem, Anecdote of the Jar? By definition, an anecdote is a short story, usually or commonly, often humorous, with a particular point in mind. Therefore, they're rather casual in nature, and a person hearing an anecdote is going to expect that there is a point to that story. The subject of this anecdote is the jar. Now, what's unusual is that the way that this title is written is rather formal, and it says Anecdote of the Jar, as though it were the definitive anecdote of the jar, when anecdotes by their nature are casual, and it would almost seem to be somewhat contradictory to speak about a definitive anecdote. We might think of any anecdote as being entirely ad hoc, um, of the moment in which it arose. Let me read this lovely poem. I placed a jar in Tennessee, and round it was, upon a hill. It made the slovenly wilderness surround that hill. The wilderness rose up to it, and sprawled around, no longer wild. The jar was round upon the ground, and tall and of a ported air. It took dominion everywhere. The jar was grey and bare. It did not give of bird or bush, like nothing else in Tennessee. Now, what's wonderful about this poem is it provokes so many responses. Every line, as it would seem, raises a question in our minds, or very simply makes us think of something. We are often presented with knots that we feel compelled to untie. The problem is, at the end, we're left with a welter of observations, a bric-a-brac, if you will, a mass of details that resists easy systematizing. As a result, in this reading, I'm just going to try to focus as tightly and exclusively on the jar as possible. First of all, what is a jar? Well, first, let me be as general as possible. A jar belongs to that set of particular objects fashioned with a particular function in mind, with a particular set of attributes. Its primary function is to preserve a small amount of food. Well, its most obvious attribute is that it's round. It's open at the top. It has to be sealable at that open end. Jars are typically tall, and they're, generally speaking, of glass, at least the classic ones. Now, from experience, we know that a jar, once it has been exhausted of food, can be used for a whole range of storage purposes: pens, pencils, coins, any other objects that we have really nowhere else to put, bric-a-brac. So no matter what its specific use is at any given time, it's always being used to contain. Of course, another way of saying to contain is to hold or keep within. Of course, the word contain, particularly when it's freed from its application in the jar, has another meaning. To hold back, as when I say contain yourself, uh, restrain your emotions, or I could say at the river's banks, can scarcely contain the river any longer, meaning the river will overflow. Now, in the first line of the poem, I placed a jar in Tennessee. The speaker, who may be the poet, is simply describing his action. He placed a jar. Now, a poet will place a word and then another word. In both cases, place something implies both conscious forethought as well as careful execution. Of course, the poet or any other creative artist is limited to the materials, the objects that he has at hand. And those objects typically will carry a whole range of significances. The jar, I think, is simply what he had at hand. He tells us that he placed the jar in Tennessee, but Tennessee is a big place. We really do require more specificity. If he simply stopped there, the reader would ask, okay, where in Tennessee? Chattanooga? Down by Wilson's Creek? On Old Man Johnson's farm? Tennessee is a big place of places, and any reader is going to feel lost. Perhaps this is the aim of the speaker in the first sentence. Now, this is being expressed in iambic tetrameter, which implies 4 beats per line. I placed a jar in Tennessee, and round it was upon a hill. Now, this is a very familiar beat meter in popular verse. As I wrote, it's warm and homey. It's very down to earth. Of course, we can be uncritical and harsh and say that it's characteristic of greeting card verse. And those of us living in a major metropolis may think that this particular meter suits a down-to-earth place like Tennessee. And this may have been all the more the case in 1918, when Tennessee was even more rural than it is today. Whatever, iambic tetrameter seems to put our minds at ease. It lulls us with its steady beat. It may even serve to conceal the gap between the size of Tennessee and the tiny size of a jar. We bounce along with the beat through the second line, and round it was upon a hill. And it appears that the question implicit in the first line seems to have been answered. It turns out that he placed a jar upon a hill in Tennessee. A hill is a specific place. It's a high place. But if we notice, the hill is still not named. So even though we feel located in a way, we still may be in the middle of nowhere in Tennessee, and we still may feel lost. Of course, not only does the steady beat continue to set our minds at ease, at least as far as it goes, the language is a little archaic, and round it was upon a hill. In fact, it even suggests to me the phrase, once upon a time. This is the standard formulaic introduction of fairy tales in English. It seems to suggest that there will be a point indeed to the story, one that may first lead us into some dark passages, but ultimately it will be an ending that is a happy one. And perhaps there will be a moral to the story by which we can live. The speaker tells us that the jar was round, which we already know. It's an obvious attribute of jars. But when we're told what we already know, there's something reassuring about that as well, as children who expect that the prince will rescue the princess at the end of the fairy tale. We want to know what's going to happen. We want to know what the state of things are. We want to know that we're safe. Now, it's only in lines 1 and 2 in that first sentence of the poem that the speaker intervenes directly in the action of the poem. Now, as we read through the poem, we see a scene being composed, but the speaker himself is only responsible for a single placement in that overall composition, which is interesting. But with that, a new, entirely novel role is attributed to the jar. It, the jar, made the slovenly wilderness surround that hill. And what is that role? What is that function? Well, it's no longer to contain anything, in other sense of the word. It is to compel the wilderness to take the shape of the hill, as though that it is the jar that is arranging the wilderness in a composition. Now, notice what else has happened in lines 3 and 4. Not only has iambic tetrameter, the bum, ba bum, ba bum, ba bum, ba bum, been abandoned, but there is absolutely no meter to this sentence. It is apoetic. It was a violation of the metrical rules of poetry, which a reader, particularly a reader who was very accustomed to a particular beat in a poem, that recognized a poem based upon the presence of a certain meter, would perhaps quite forcefully reject. As I wrote here, the jar is liberated from its function. It has the creative agency of the speaker. As I said, it no longer merely contains, it now compels the objects around it to conform to its agenda. Now let's look closely at the sentence in which the jar, so to speak, gained its liberation. It made the slovenly wilderness surround the hill. This word slovenly is used to describe, let's say, the ugly in human life, um, departures from taste, where wildness might creep into life and undermine its culturally pristine state. Now, it's typically applied to people or to places, one's home, for example, but it may indeed be rightly applied here. This is an ugly sentence that has abandoned and has rejected all the conventions of proper metrical construction. There must be an element of force in creation, as I said. The creator takes that which is at hand and fashions it into a form that conforms to his wishes and not to the wishes of the original wild state. But it isn't a case of everything goes in creation. Ultimately, we are bound to and regulated by a set of rules. In other words, we're back to the original function of the jar, to contain. As we will see in the next part of the video, the poem will be compelled to behave like a poem again, and the jar a jar, with very interesting consequences.